This scorched black organ isn't from a fire victim, it is a cowboy's stomach, dissolved by a single night in a Wild West saloon. Forget the Hollywood myths of polished bars and fine whiskey. We are descending into a world where the floor was a toxic sludge of blood and spit, where a single shot could blind you forever, and where the house special hid a secret so nauseating it borders on accidental cannibalism. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the true taste of the Old West wasn't dust, it was death. On a dusty shelf in the shadowed corner of the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, there stands a forgotten glass jar that causes even the most veteran pathologists to shudder in discomfort. Suspended in a cloudy, yellowing solution of formalin floats a human stomach, ulcerated and scorched to a deep, necrotic blackness. The organ looks as though its owner had swallowed live coals straight from a blacksmith's furnace, the tissue ravaged by heat and destruction. Yet, this stomach did not belong to a victim of a house fire, nor was it taken from a desperate suicide who consumed industrial acid to end their suffering. This horrific specimen belonged to a young cowboy, a man no older than 25, who died in the year 1880. His death was not caused by a bullet or a stampede, but followed what was considered a completely ordinary night in a frontier saloon. This silent, floating exhibit serves as the only truthful witness of a lost era, acting as a gruesome counterpoint to the history books. It systematically destroys the romantic myth of noble gunslingers and amber whiskey that Hollywood has force-fed the world for over a century. Instead of adventure and glory, this preserved organ tells a harrowing story of how greed and unregulated chemistry killed men faster than any revolver. It invites us to look past the swinging doors and the piano music to see the biological devastation that fueled the Western economy. Modern observers often struggle to reconcile the image of the rugged pioneer with the fragile, decimated flesh inside the glass. We are conditioned to believe that the whiskey of the Wild West was simply strong, a symbol of masculinity and fortitude in a lawless land. But the reality floating in that preservative fluid reveals that the drink was often a weapon disguised as a commodity. The lining of the stomach has been chemically shredded, the result of a corrosive assault that began the moment the liquid touched the tongue. The young man who possessed this organ likely paid a week's wages for the privilege of poisoning himself. He would have stood at a rough-hewn bar, surrounded by the camaraderie of his peers, unaware that he was ingesting a solvent capable of stripping varnish from wood. Pathology reports from the late 19th century were often vague, citing congestion or inflammation, failing to capture the true nature of the toxic event. However, this surviving sample proves that the internal burns were consistent with the ingestion of poisons like oil of vitriol or concentrated ammonia. The physical sensation of drinking such a concoction would have been an immediate, blinding agony mistaken for the kick of high-proof alcohol. The burning in the throat was not a sign of quality, but a biological warning signal that was tragicomically ignored by the drinker. As the liquid settled, it did not warm the blood but began to digest the drinker from the inside out. The mucous membranes, designed to protect the body, were instantly overwhelmed by the caustic additives mixed by a bartender who cared only for profit. This jar remains the most potent prologue to our journey, anchoring us in the visceral reality of the time. It strips away the veneer of nostalgia, forcing us to acknowledge that the primary danger in a saloon was not the man standing next to you, but the glass in your hand. Before we can explore the sticky floors and the toxic recipes in detail, we must accept this blackened remnant as our guide. It is a permanent monument to the thousands of nameless men who dissolved their insides in the pursuit of a moment's relief. The story of the Wild West Saloon is not one of hospitality, but of a slow, agonizing massacre conducted for pennies. This stomach is the first piece of evidence in a case against an entire industry that thrived on the suffering of the lonely and the thirsty. Stepping through the swinging batwing doors of a genuine frontier saloon was never the cinematic entrance portrayed in Western films. There was no jovial ragtime melody drifting from a polished piano to greet the weary traveler, nor was there a warm hearth to welcome him. Instead, the first sensation to assault a new arrival was a physical wall of stench so dense and overpowering that it frequently caused men to stagger backward. It was a thick, invisible barrier that separated the relatively fresh air of the street from the stagnant, poisonous atmosphere trapped inside. For a man unaccustomed to the frontier, the initial breath taken within those wooden walls was a shock to the respiratory system that induced immediate gagging. The air did not circulate, it hung suspended in the gloom, heavy with the weight of 1,000 biological processes occurring simultaneously. The primary ingredient in this noxious cocktail was the smell of unwashed humanity, concentrated to a degree that is unimaginable to the modern nose. Cowboys and miners often wore the same heavy woolen clothes for months on end, sweating into the fabric day after day under the scorching sun. Bathing was a rare luxury reserved for special occasions, and many of the patrons had not touched a bar of soap or a basin of water in weeks. Layers of dried sweat, stale grease, and accumulated road dust created a pungent aura that radiated from every body packed into the room. This scent was amplified by the intense heat generated by the crush of bodies and the burning of kerosene lamps that flickered dimly in the haze. The temperature inside a crowded saloon could rise 20 degrees above the outside air, turning the room into a fermenting incubator for bacteria. Underneath the heavy blanket of body odor lay the sharp, stinging scent of ammonia that watered the eyes and burned the lining of the throat. This was not a cleaning agent, but the undeniable stench of stale urine rising from the dark corners and the floorboards themselves. In the chaos of a busy night, few men bothered to fight their way to the back exit to relieve themselves in the alley or the outhouse. It was common practice to simply urinate against the wall or directly onto the floor, relying on the sawdust to hide the evidence. Mixing with the ammonia was the cloying, sweet smell of rotting food remnants that had been dropped and trampled into the muck. The free lunch counters, often piled with salty meats to induce thirst, contributed scraps of gristle and bone that decayed slowly in the heat. But the true horror of the saloon environment was found by looking down at the ground beneath one's boots. Forget the polished hardwood floors or the clean tiles that adorn the recreations of the Wild West in theme parks today. The floor of a real saloon was a biological hazard zone, a dark, shifting landscape covered in a layer of sawdust that could be inches deep. This sawdust was not there for decoration, it was a utilitarian sponge designed to absorb the endless torrent of fluids unleashed by the patrons. Fresh sawdust was a rarity, scattered perhaps once a month by a proprietor who cared little for hygiene and only for profit. For the remaining 29 days, the wood shavings slowly transformed into a heavy, viscous sludge that clung to everything it touched. The most prevalent liquid in this toxic slurry was the brown, viscous discharge of chewing tobacco, which was consumed in massive quantities. Spittoons were sometimes present, but in a crowded room, accuracy was low, and most men simply spat on the floor without a second thought. Thousands of gallons of tobacco juice coated the saloon floors of the West, turning the sawdust into a dark, sticky marsh. Walking across the room was not a silent affair, it was accompanied by the wet, squelching sound of boots pulling free from the adhesive grip of the muck. Intermingled with the tobacco spit were puddles of spilled alcohol, the cheap and sugary, tarantula juice, that acted as a binding agent for the filth. This spilled liquor evaporated into the air, adding a sickly, fermented undertone to the already unbearable atmosphere. Then there was the blood, an inevitable byproduct of a society where conflict resolution involved knives and broken bottles. When a fight broke out, the loser often bled directly into the sawdust, and no one rushed to mop up the crimson stains with antiseptic. The blood simply dried and mixed with the spit and the urine, becoming just another layer in the geological strata of the saloon floor. This unholy mixture created a breeding ground for disease that would terrify a modern epidemiologist. Patrons stood ankle-deep in this mire, their boots coated in a paste composed of human waste, toxic saliva, and decaying organic matter. The hemlines of long coats and the edges of trousers dragged through the sludge, wicking the filth upward into the fabric. The sensory experience of standing in this muck was heightened by the sound of millions of flies that thrived in the unsanitary conditions. The buzzing was a constant, low-frequency drone that permeated the room, as insects feasted on the filth below and the sweat of the men above. In the winter months, when the doors were sealed tight to keep out the freezing wind, the conditions became even more suffocating and dangerous. With no ventilation, the carbon dioxide levels rose, and the concentration of airborne pathogens reached critical mass. Men breathed in the vaporized particles of dried sputum and fecal dust that kicked up every time a fight broke out or a dance began. They were inhaling the literal waste of their peers, taking the biology of the saloon deep into their lungs with every laugh and shout. The lack of sunlight in these windowless dens meant that mold and fungus flourished in the damp corners where the sawdust was never changed. The wood of the walls and the bar itself absorbed the odors, sweating them back out when the room heated up at night. To the men of the 1880s, this environment was normalized, a standard feature of their rough existence on the frontier. They did not perceive the immediate danger of the bacterial colony they were wading through, seeing it only as the cost of doing business. Yet, the atmosphere itself was a slow-acting poison, weakening immune systems and spreading tuberculosis and pneumonia with terrifying efficiency. A night of drinking involved exposure to a biological load that the human body was never designed to withstand in such concentration. The floor was effectively a living organism, a shifting ecosystem of decay that digested whatever fell upon it. Coins dropped in the sawdust were often abandoned, not worth the risk of plunging a hand into the cold, wet slime to retrieve them. Even the dogs that wandered in from the street hesitated to lie down in the filth, preferring to curl up on the relatively cleaner wooden chairs. The animals seemed to possess an instinct for hygiene that their human masters had long since abandoned in the pursuit of intoxication. This was the reality of the floor covered in slime that history has conveniently scrubbed from its collective memory. It was a place where the concept of cleanliness did not exist, and where the ground you stood on was as toxic as the drink in your hand. The romantic image of the cowboy leaning casually against the bar collapses when one realizes he was standing in a cesspool of his own making. The physical stickiness of the floor was so profound that in the mornings, cleaning crews often had to use shovels to scrape the compacted layers. These swampers, as the cleaners were called, had the most wretched job in the West, battling a tide of filth that returned every single night. They would haul out wheelbarrows full of the saturated sawdust, dumping the biohazardous waste in the alleys behind the saloon. But they could never get it all. The base layer of the floor remained, permanently soaked with the fluids of the previous decade. It was a historical record written in grime, preserving the DNA of every drunkard, brawler, and gambler who had ever passed through. The sheer volume of expectoration alone is staggering to consider when reading accounts from the 1870s. Visitors from the East Coast or Europe often wrote home in horror, describing floors that looked as if they were moving due to the liquid volume. One traveler noted in 1882 that the floor of a Leadville saloon was a lake of filth that required high boots to navigate safely. It was not uncommon for men to slip on the slick surface during a brawl, falling face first into the toxic mixture. Such a fall was not merely humiliating, it was a potential death sentence if an open wound came into contact with the bacterial soup. Infections that began as minor scratches on a saloon floor often resulted in gangrene and amputation within a week. The air, thick with the fumes of this decomposition, clung to the skin and hair of the patrons long after they left. A man who had spent the night in a saloon carried the stench of the place with him like a branded mark, announcing his habits to everyone he met. This olfactory brand was the true signature of the Wild West, far more prevalent than the smell of gunpowder or saddle leather. It was the smell of a society living in squalor, seeking oblivion in dark rooms that were slowly killing them. As we visualize the saloon now, we must strip away the Hollywood gloss and replace it with this gritty, nauseating reality. We must see the flies, feel the humidity, and smell the overwhelming reek of ammonia and rot that defined the social center of the town. We must imagine the squelch of the boot, the sting in the eye, and the heavy, suffocating weight of the air in the lungs. Only then can we understand that the saloon was not a glamorous escape, but a descent into a lower circle of hygiene hell. The foundation of the frontier social life was literally built on a layer of toxic waste, hidden in plain sight under the sawdust. It was a testament to the endurance of the human constitution that anyone survived these places at all, let alone frequented them nightly. This was the stage upon which the drama of the West played out, a stage slick with spit and smelling of death. And it was into this sensory nightmare that the bartender, the alchemist of the plains, would serve his deadly creations. Behind the scarred mahogany of the bar stood a figure who bore no resemblance to the jovial innkeepers found in folklore. He was not a friend to the weary traveler, nor a confidant for the lonely heart, but a cold and calculating chemist of the underworld. His apron was stiff with dried spills, and his eyes scanned the room not with hospitality, but with the predatory gaze of a wolf estimating the weakness of a flock. The driving force behind his dark trade was a simple, brutal economic reality that governed the entire frontier. Transporting barrels of genuine Kentucky bourbon or fine Scotch whiskey across thousands of miles of rugged terrain was an impossibly expensive endeavor. By the time a wagon train survived the mountains, the bandits, and the taxes, the price of a single bottle exceeded a week's wages. To maintain the illusion of plenty while maximizing profit, the saloon keeper turned to a twisted form of alchemy. His goal was to transmute the cheapest, vilest liquids available into something that passed for whiskey in the dim light. He became a master of adulteration, creating recipes that would cause a modern toxicologist to recoil in absolute horror. The base of these concoctions was rarely grain alcohol intended for human consumption, which was still too costly for the bottom line. Instead, They utilized barrels of raw industrial spirit, intended for cleaning machinery or fueling lamps. This high-proof solvent was the canvas upon which they painted their deadly masterpieces, indifferent to the blindness it might cause. To mimic the warm, amber glow of oak-aged bourbon, the bartender resorted to repulsive organic dyes. He would take plugs of old chewing tobacco, sometimes scavenged from the very spittoons on the floor, and boil them to extract a dark brown juice. This nicotine-rich sludge was poured into the clear spirit, staining it to the color of tea and adding a numbing bitterness. But color was not enough, the drink needed to possess a scent that could cut through the stench of the room. Generous splashes of turpentine were added to the barrel, lending the mixture a sharp, pine-like aroma that cleared the sinuses. It was the smell of a carpenter's workshop, masked just enough to fool a man who had already lost his sense of smell to the dust. To simulate the warming kick of high-proof liquor, the chemist added ingredients that did not warm, but chemically burned. Cayenne pepper was often tossed in by the handful to blister the tongue and distract from the metallic taste. Even liquid ammonia found its way into the mix, providing a volatile vapor that hit the back of the throat like a physical blow. The most sinister additions, however, were the poisons used to mimic the physiological effects of extreme intoxication. Small amounts of strychnine, a pesticide used to kill wolves and rats, were carefully measured into the casks. In low doses, strychnine acts as a powerful stimulant, causing the nerves to fire rapidly and the muscles to twitch. When a cowboy drank this laced swill, he felt a sudden, electric jolt that he mistook for the rush of strong alcohol. His hands would shake, his heart would race, and he would feel hyper-alert, believing he was drinking the finest stuff on earth. It was a chemically induced seizure waiting to happen, sold to him as a premium experience. Arsenic was another favorite on the ingredient list, prized for the way it made the drinker feel flushed and warm. It dilated the blood vessels, creating a false sensation of heat spreading through the chest and limbs. The customer, shivering from the winter cold outside, would praise the bartender for the warmth, unknowingly ingesting a heavy metal poison. Some recipes were even more volatile, incorporating black gunpowder to give the drink a literal explosive quality. The sulfur and charcoal in the powder added a grim, earthy flavor that men associated with toughness and grit. Drinking it was an act of bravado, a way to prove that one's stomach was lined with iron. This hellish brew earned names that were as colorful as they were terrifyingly accurate warnings. Men leaned over the bar and asked for a glass of coffin varnish, acknowledging that it would coat their insides like furniture lacquer. They called it tarantula juice, implying that the spasms it caused were akin to the bite of a venomous spider. The potency of this liquid was such that it was rumored to be able to dissolve a steel nail if left in a glass overnight. It could strip the rust off a plowshare and clean the grease from a wagon axle better than any soap. Yet, living men willingly poured this corrosive solvent down their soft, unprotected throats. The tragedy of this transaction was magnified by the currency used to purchase the poison. Prospectors who had spent months knee-deep in freezing rivers, panning for gold, would slap their leather pouches on the counter. They paid for their own destruction with the purest gold dust, trading the product of their agonizing labor for a cup of death. The bartender would bring out his brass scales, carefully weighing the pinch of gold dust against the cost of the drink. It was a robbery committed in plain sight, an exchange where the customer was cheated twice, once on the price and once on the product. The chemist knew the true value of the yellow metal, and he knew the worthlessness of the brown liquid. The addictive nature of the additives ensured that the customer would return, driven by a chemical dependency not just on alcohol, but on the stimulants. The strychnine created a jagged, nervous energy that demanded more of the very substance that was causing it. The cycle was self-perpetuating, trapping the victim in a loop of poisoning and temporary relief. Behind his stoic expression, the saloon owner was fully aware of the biological havoc he was wreaking. He watched as the regulars grew thinner, their skin taking on the gray pallor of chronic arsenic poisoning. He saw the tremors in their hands that never went away, even when they were sober. He was not merely a merchant, he was a slow-motion executioner operating without a hood or a scaffold. A bullet from a Colt revolver was honest and quick, ending a life in a fraction of a second. The bartender's weapon was insidious, a slow-acting acid that ate away at the customer's sanity and organs over months. Imagine the scene in the back room, the bartender stirring a vat with a broom handle, the fumes stinging his own eyes. He pours in a gallon of molasses to thicken the thin industrial spirit, masking its harsh texture. He adds a handful of red peppers, watching them sink into the murky depths like drowning men. History has often painted these men as colorful characters, keepers of the town's secrets and friends to the lawmen. In truth, they were often the most dangerous men in the settlement, killing more citizens than the bandits ever could. They operated with impunity, protected by the fact that every man in town was addicted to their product. As the night wore on, the effects of the chemical cocktail would reach their peak. Men would not just pass out, they would collapse into comas, their breathing shallow and ragged. The bartender would wipe down the counter, indifferent to the bodies on the floor, counting his gold and preparing the next batch of lethal whiskey for the survivors. To raise a glass of this adulterated swill to one's lips was not an act of leisure, but a declared war against one's own biology. The liquid did not slide down the throat with the smooth warmth of aged spirits, it scraped its way down, a corrosive intruder that triggered every alarm system the human body possesses. The stomach, sensing the sudden arrival of turpentine, heavy metals, and raw alcohol, would often spasm in a desperate, violent attempt to reject the poison. Men had to physically fight their own gag reflexes, swallowing bile and saliva to keep the expensive toxin inside their burning bellies, viewing the pain as a challenge. Unlike genuine alcohol, which acts as a depressant to soothe the mind and slow the reflexes, the strychnine-laced compounds served as a high-octane fuel for the nervous system. Within minutes of the first gulp, the drinker did not feel the dull numbness of intoxication, but a terrifying clarity and a surge of jagged energy. Muscles began to vibrate under the skin, a sensation known as the jerks that seasoned drinkers somehow convinced themselves was a sign of masculine vitality. Fingers drummed manic rhythms on the bar top, and eyes darted around the room with the predatory intensity of a trapped animal, scanning for threats that did not exist. The brain, besieged by powerful neurotoxins, began to misinterpret sensory input, twisting reality into a threatening landscape of shadows and danger. A friendly hand placed on a shoulder was no longer a gesture of camaraderie, but was perceived by the poisoned mind as the claw of a demon or the grip of an assassin. This chemical interference rewrites the history of the legendary saloon shootouts, stripping them of their cinematic nobility and concepts of honor. The violence that erupted was rarely about a hidden ace of spades, an unpaid debt, or a disparaging remark made about a woman's virtue. Instead, the gunfire was often the result of a sudden, toxic psychosis where the shooter's brain was literally boiling in a soup of stimulants. Rational thought evaporated, replaced by a primal, chemically induced imperative to destroy the hallucinations crowding his peripheral vision. Best friends who had ridden the dusty trails together for years would suddenly turn on one another with the ferocity of starving wolves. The poison whispered paranoia into their ears, convincing them that their lifelong partner was plotting a betrayal that existed only in the ether of their delirium. The strychnine acted on the spinal cord, removing the inhibitory signals that keep muscle tone in check, turning the body into a loaded spring. A sudden noise, like a dropped glass or a loud laugh, could trigger a violent startle response that resulted in a finger pulling a trigger before the mind had decided to fire. On the sawdust floor, the scene was even more grotesque, resembling a medieval torture chamber rather than a place of social gathering. Men did not merely stumble and fall in a drunken stupor, they stiffened into rigid arcs, their spines hyperextended by the tetanic contractions caused by the strychnine. The facial muscles would snap into a rictus of agony, pulling the lips back from the teeth in a horrifying, fixed grin known to doctors as the rhizus sardonicus. To the drunken observer peering through the smoke, this death mask looked like a manic laugh, a sign that the cowboy was having the time of his life. White foam, often tinged with pink from bitten tongues, bubbled from the mouths of men writhing in the filth of the floor. This was the body's desperate attempt to purge the toxins, a biological exorcism happening in the middle of a crowded room, yet it was met with indifference. The reaction of the surrounding patrons provides the most chilling insight into the psychology of the frontier saloon. Instead of rushing to help the victim or calling for a doctor, the crowd would often cheer, raising their glasses to the fallen man's supposed constitution. The convulsing figure was viewed as a testament to the potency of the liquor, a living advertisement for the bartender's skill at mixing. "That must be powerful stuff," they would mutter with admiration, ordering another round of the very fluid that was currently killing the men at their feet. For the victim, the room became a kaleidoscope of terror, where the piano music sounded like screaming and the gas lights burned like suns. The strychnine amplified sound and light to painful levels, making the chaotic environment of the saloon physically agonizing to endure. Visual hallucinations were common, with men clawing at their own skin to remove imaginary insects or striking out at invisible specters. The snakes in the boots were not just a metaphor for a hangover, but a literal terrifying vision induced by the toxicity of the alcohol and the withdrawal that followed. This cycle of poisoning and violence became normalized, accepted as the standard cost of entertainment in a harsh and unforgiving world. The line between a fun night out and a psychotic break was erased by the chemistry of the barrel, creating a culture of absolute unpredictability. When the smoke cleared and the spasms stopped, the survivors often had no memory of the events that had transpired during their psychosis. They woke up in jail cells or alleyways, confused and aching, unaware that they had been temporary vessels for a chemical demon that had hijacked their will. Judges and sheriffs rarely investigated the contents of the stomach or the bottle, ruling these deaths as simple drunkenness or self-defense. The true culprit, the toxic admixture that hijacked the human mind, remained at large, ready to be served to the next thirsty soul who walked through the door. We must understand that this was not an isolated incident, but a nightly occurrence across thousands of saloons from Kansas to California. An entire generation of men was unknowingly subjecting themselves to experimental toxicology tests every Saturday night, paying for the privilege with their sanity. The violence was not just external, directed at others with a gun, but internal, tearing apart the very fabric of the self and the nervous system. It was a mass poisoning event disguised as a social ritual, leaving behind a trail of broken bodies and bewildered minds across the frontier. The neurological damage was often permanent, leaving men with tremors, tics, and a propensity for rage that lasted long after they sobered up. The mean drunk of the West was often a man suffering from chronic heavy metal poisoning and organic brain damage caused by his beverage of choice. In this light, the saloon brawl transforms from a scene of rough adventure into a tragic medical emergency ignored by the spectators. The chaos was not a product of freedom or lawlessness, but a specific symptom of the poison supply chain that fed the West. The man on the floor, finally still, became just another obstacle to step over, a mound of clothing and silence in the din. The piano player would resume his tune, and the bartender would wipe the spittle from the counter, ready to pour the next dose of madness for a fresh customer. The dawn that broke over the frontier towns in the 1880s was harsh and unforgiving, sending shafts of blinding white sunlight cutting through the dusty streets. But for a terrifying number of men stirring in the back rooms of saloons or on the floorboards of boarding houses, this sunrise never happened. They awoke not to the golden glow of morning, but to a dense, impenetrable darkness that they initially mistook for the dead of night. They lay on their cots, listening to the sounds of the town waking up around them, the rumble of wagons, the barking of dogs, the hammer of the blacksmith, confused by the disconnect between their ears and their eyes. This was not the pounding headache and cottonmouth dryness of a standard hangover, which was a familiar and manageable penance for a night of excess. This was a systemic biological collapse, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on the chest and a silence in the visual cortex that signaled a catastrophic failure of the nervous system. The culprit was methyl alcohol, commonly known as wood alcohol, a cheap industrial solvent that unscrupulous distillers used to stretch their supply of grain spirits. While it looked and smelled like ethanol, its chemical structure made it a lethal distinct cousin, one that the human body was utterly ill-equipped to process safely. Once ingested, the liver, in its attempt to filter the toxins, tragically converted the methanol into formaldehyde and then into formic acid. This metabolic process turned the drinker's blood into a corrosive acidic bath, lowering the pH of the body to dangerous levels and launching a targeted attack on the most sensitive organs. The primary victim of this internal acidification was the optic nerve, a delicate bundle of fibers responsible for transmitting images from the eye to the brain. The formic acid acted like a chemical guillotine, stripping the myelin sheath from the nerve and effectively severing the connection between the world and the mind. The tragedy of methanol poisoning was its delay. The blindness often did not set in until 12 to 24 hours after consumption. A cowboy could drink the tainted swill on a Saturday night, feel perfectly fine on Sunday morning, and then descend into total darkness by Sunday evening as the metabolites built up in his system. For those waking up in the pitch black, the realization came with a slow, creeping horror that is difficult to articulate in words. A man would strike a match to check the time, feel the heat of the flame against his fingers, hear the flare of the sulfur, yet see absolutely nothing in the void before him. He would rub his eyes frantically, assuming they were crusted shut or that the room was filled with smoke, panic rising in his throat like bile. He would stumble to the window and throw open the shutters, feeling the warmth of the midday sun on his face while his eyes registered only a flat, gray static. The scream that followed was a sound specific to the frontier, a primal howl of realization that a vital sense had been stolen forever. It was the sound of a life ending, not in death, but in the total erasure of independence, transforming a rugged survivor into a helpless invalid in the span of a heartbeat. These blinded men became a common, tragic feature of the Western landscape, wandering the streets like ghosts of their former selves. Towns from Deadwood to Tombstone were populated by an army of sightless beggars, men who weeks before had been sharpshooters, cattle drivers, and expert prospectors. They were often young, in the prime of their physical strength, their muscles still hard from labor, but their eyes were milky and vacant. They shuffled along the wooden boardwalks, their hands trailing along the rough grain of the walls, learning to navigate the geography of the town by touch and smell alone. There was a cruel irony in their orbit. They often congregated around the very saloons that had dispensed the poison that destroyed them. The saloon was the center of gravity in the town, the place of warmth and noise, and even after the betrayal, these men had nowhere else to go. They would lean against the outside walls of the establishments, listening to the piano music and the clinking of glasses that they could no longer see. They became living, breathing monuments to the toxicity of the trade, yet the patrons stepping past them rarely paused to consider the warning their presence implied. The blind men used their canes to tap out a rhythm on the planks, a sound that became part of the background noise of the West. They begged for coins from the very bartenders who had mixed the lethal cocktails, receiving pity pennies that were effectively a refund on their own destruction. Inside the medical offices, the local doctors were overwhelmed and often complicit in the silence surrounding the epidemic. Medical knowledge on the frontier was rudimentary at best, and few physicians had the training to recognize the specific signs of acute methanol toxicity. When a man died from the poisoning, slipping into a coma as his respiratory system failed, the cause of death was rarely recorded accurately. The ledgers of the era are filled with vague, catch-all diagnoses such as congestion of the brain, apoplexy, or simply natural causes brought on by intemperance. To diagnose a chemical poisoning was to accuse the local business owners, often the most powerful men in town, of murder. It was politically dangerous and physically risky for a town doctor to suggest that the whiskey at the main saloon was a lethal weapon. Furthermore, the symptoms of methanol poisoning, dizziness, confusion, and convulsions, mimicked those of a stroke or severe alcohol withdrawal. It was convenient for everyone involved to blame the constitution of the victim rather than the composition of the drink. The sheer scale of this medical disaster was successfully buried under the dirt of the frontier cemeteries. Thousands of healthy young men died or went blind, and their fates were written off as the inevitable result of a hard life, rather than the result of industrial manslaughter. The blindness was often preceded by a visual phenomenon known as the snowfield, where the victim's vision would become white and blurry. Men would complain of a sudden fog descending in the saloon, a warning sign that was universally ignored or laughed off as drunkenness. By the time the snow turned to black, the damage to the optic nerve was irreversible, the tissue necrotic and dead. There was no cure, no surgery, and no therapy that could restore the sight stolen by the wood alcohol. The economic impact on these individuals was instantaneous and catastrophic. A blind man could not pan for gold, ride a horse, or shoot a gun. He was instantly relegated to the absolute bottom rung of society, dependent on charity in a world that despised weakness. Many of these blinded men, unable to bear the sudden transition from self-reliance to dependency, chose to end their own lives. The sound of a single gunshot in a boarding house room often marked the final chapter of a story that began with a cheap drink. For those who survived, their remaining senses became hyper-tuned to the environment that had betrayed them. They learned to recognize the specific creak of the saloon doors, the smell of the specific poison that had blinded them, and the voices of the men who sold it. They became the silent accusers, standing on the street corners, their tin cups extended, their blank eyes reflecting the bustling town they could no longer participate in. They were the collateral damage of the unregulated alcohol trade, human debris left behind by the rush for profit. The frontier mythology celebrates the risk-takers, but it conveniently forgets these men who took a risk on a glass of whiskey and lost everything. Their history is written not in gunfights or gold strikes, but in the darkness they were forced to inhabit for decades. Even the dogs seemed to know, giving the blind beggars a wide berth as they navigated the treacherous, muddy streets. The blind Toms and sightless Jacks became fixtures of the town, cautionary tales that no one actually listened to. As the years passed, the cause of their blindness was forgotten, and they simply became old, broken men of the town. The connection between the bottle of red-eye and the white cane was severed in the public consciousness, allowing the cycle to continue. The morning sun would continue to rise over the mountains, illuminating the majestic landscape of the West. But for the victims of the saloon chemist, the sun had set permanently in 1880, leaving them in an eternal, chemical night. The most terrifying secret of the frontier saloon was not found in the violence of the card tables or the toxicity of the glasses, but in the silence of the deep winter. When the temperature plummeted well below zero in the northern territories, the ground underwent a transformation that turned the soil into an impenetrable sheet of iron. For the undertakers and the townspeople of places like Deadwood or Bannack, the simple act of digging a grave became a physical impossibility from November until April. A pickaxe swung with full force would bounce off the frozen earth with a ringing clang, jarring the bones of the digger without chipping more than a flake of dirt. Yet, death did not suspend its operations simply because the ground was too hard to receive the bodies of the fallen. Drifters, gamblers, and alcoholics continued to die with alarming regularity, succumbing to pneumonia, exposure, or the cumulative effects of the poisons they drank. In the earliest days of a settlement, these winter corpses were simply stacked like cordwood in a shed or an unheated back room, waiting for the spring thaw. However, the presence of decaying organic matter, even in the cold, attracted wolves, rats, and other scavengers that would gnaw through wood to reach the meat. A solution was required that was both practical and preservative, a method to keep the dead from becoming a health hazard to the living. The answer lay in the very barrels that lined the walls of the saloon, filled with the high-proof, industrial-grade alcohol that was the lifeblood of the town. It became a dark, unspoken custom in remote settlements to utilize the surplus inventory of spirit as a temporary embalming fluid for the unclaimed dead. The logic was purely utilitarian. Alcohol was a known preservative, used by medical schools and naturalists to keep specimens from rotting for years. When a nameless transient died on the floor of the saloon, usually with no next of kin to claim him, the proprietor would not drag him out into the snow. Instead, under the cover of night, the body would be stripped of its meager possessions and folded into a fetal position to fit through the opening of a large cask. The sound of a human body splashing into 40 gallons of raw spirits was a heavy, wet thud that echoed in the empty cellar, a sound that those involved tried hard to forget. The lid was hammered back into place, sealing the dead man inside a coffin of oak and liquid, where he would float in the darkness for months. Inside the barrel, a gruesome chemical exchange began to take place as the weeks of winter dragged on. The high concentration of ethanol penetrated the tissues of the corpse, halting the process of decomposition and effectively pickling the skin and organs. But the exchange was not one way. The fluids of the body, the fats, and the proteins, slowly leached out into the surrounding alcohol. The clear, harsh liquid took on a murky quality, absorbing the essence of the men who floated suspended within it, turning the spirit into a broth of death. For months, the patrons of the saloon would drink and gamble directly above the cellar where these silent guests were waiting out the frost. The floorboards they walked on separated the living revelers from the submerged dead by only a few feet, a proximity that was grotesque in its intimacy. When the Chinooks finally blew in from the west and the ground softened into mud, the time for burial had finally arrived. The barrels were rolled out to the graveyard or a potter's field, and the grim task of extraction began, often performed by the same men who had sealed them. The bodies, now rubbery and gray but perfectly preserved, were hooked and pulled from the bung or through the removed head of the barrel. They were hastily buried in shallow graves, without ceremony or prayer, the problem of their disposal finally resolved by the turning of the seasons. However, the true horror of the story began once the grave was filled and the shovel was put away. The saloon keeper was left with a barrel containing 30 or so gallons of alcohol that had been used as embalming fluid, a commodity that represented a significant financial investment. To throw away such a large quantity of product was unthinkable to men whose morality had long been eroded by the pursuit of gold. The frontier was a place of extreme scarcity, where nothing was wasted, and the definition of what was consumable was terrifyingly flexible. The whiskey, now thick with dissolved body fat and stained by the fluids of the corpse, was not discarded into the gutter. It was rolled back into the saloon, hoisted onto the rack behind the bar, and prepared for the thirsty crowds that always arrived with the spring. To mask the sickly, cloying sweetness of the dead flesh, the chemist behind the bar would employ his entire arsenal of strong flavors. Handfuls of chewing tobacco, sticks of cinnamon, burnt sugar, and dried peppers were dumped into the barrel to overpower the undeniable taste of mortality. This concoction was often marketed as a special, aged reserve, a premium blend that had been mellowing in the cask all winter. The darkening of the liquid, caused by the decomposition, was sold to the customer as the result of fine oak interaction, a visual lie that invited trust. When the miners returned from the hills, their pockets heavy with dust and their throats parched, they paid top dollar for this stout drink. They would hold the glass up to the light, admiring the deep amber hue, completely unaware that the color was derived from human organic matter. The taste was described as unique, with a heavy body and a richness that seemed to coat the tongue and throat. Patrons would slap the bar and declare it the best whiskey they had tasted in years, praising its smoothness and the strange, savory undertone that lingered. There is a profound and nauseating irony in the fact that the most celebrated drink in the camp was literally an infusion of the previous year's loser. The man who had died of alcoholism the winter before was now fueling the alcoholism of the men who took his place at the bar. This cycle of consumption created a form of accidental cannibalism, a communion of the damned where the living fed upon the dead to fuel their vices. It was the ultimate expression of the saloon's predatory nature, consuming its patrons first financially, then physically, and finally turning them into product. Rumors of this practice circulated, of course, whispered by swampers and stable boys who had seen too much in the cellars. But the thirst of the frontier was so insatiable that most men chose to ignore the stories, preferring the comfort of the drink to the horror of the truth. There were grim jokes about stiff drinks and dead man's drop, but few realized how literally those terms applied to the glass in their hand. The mythology of the West is filled with tales of survival, but this particular survival tactic is conveniently left out of the history books. Modern forensic analysis of bottles recovered from the era has occasionally shown trace proteins that have no business being in distilled spirits. These microscopic ghosts serve as the scientific validation of the gruesome campfire tales that have survived for a century. The emotional reaction to this revelation is not just disgust, but a deep, unsettling violation of the human contract. We expect our food and drink to sustain life, not to serve as a vehicle for the recycling of the dead in the name of profit. This practice represents the absolute nadir of the Wild West's disregard for human dignity, a low point where a human being was reduced to a flavoring agent. It strips away the last shreds of romance from the era, leaving only a cold, mercenary reality that chills the blood. Imagine the final scene, a rowdy saloon in 1881, the piano playing a lively tune, the air thick with smoke. A young cowboy raises a glass in a toast to his good fortune, smiling at his friends, the liquid catching the light. He swallows the shot, grimacing at the burn, feeling the warmth spread through his chest, unaware of the DNA he has just ingested. He wipes his mouth, slams the glass down, and asks for another, unknowingly participating in the most macabre ritual of the American frontier. The history of the West is often written in blood, but in the case of the saloon, it was also written in the silent, fluid exchange between the living and the dead. And as the cowboy orders his second round, the jar on the shelf in Philadelphia seems to vibrate slightly, a silent witness to the toxicity that defined an age.